Chapter 4 of In the Field, 1914-1915. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by FNH. In the Field, 1914-1915 by Marcel Dupont. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The Joulgon Affair. On September the 9th, at about 8 o'clock in the evening, our advanced scouts entered Montigny-les-Condé at the moment when the last dragoons of the Prussian Guard were leaving it at full speed. Our pursuit was stopped by the night, which was very dark. Large, threatening clouds were moving across the sky, making it impossible to see 10 paces ahead. Whilst the captains were hastily posting guards all round the village, whilst the lieutenants were erecting barricades at all the outlets and setting sentries over them, the quartermasters had all the barns and stables thrown open. With the help of the inhabitants, they portioned out, as well as they could, the insufficient accommodation among the men and the horses of the squadron. In each troop, camp fires were lighted under the shelter of walls, so that the enemy could not see them. What a dinner we had that evening! It was in a large room with a low, open roof supported by small beams. The walls were smoke-blackened and dirty. On a chest placed near the door, I can still see a big pile of ration loaves, thrown together anyhow, and leaning over the hearth of the large fireplace, lit by the wood fire, was an unknown man who was stirring something in a pot. Round the large table a score of hungry and jaded but merry officers were fraternally sharing some pieces of meat which the man took out of the pot. The Captain and I ate off of the same plate and drank out of the same metal cup, for crockery was scarce. The poor woman of the house ran round the table, consumed by her eagerness to make everybody comfortable. And in the farthest corner, away from the light, a very old peasant with a dazed look and haggard eyes was watching the unexpected scene. The company heartily cheered Captain C. for his cleverness in finding and bringing to light, from some nook or other, a large pitcher of rough wine. For 3 days we had been pursuing and fighting the German army, and we were tired out. But we had not felt it until the evening on stopping to give our poor horses a little rest. Before the last mouthful had been swallowed, several of us were already snoring, with their heads on their arms upon the table. The rest were talking about the situation. The enemy was retreating rapidly on the Marne. He must have crossed it by now, leaving as cover for his retreat the division of the cavalry of the Guard which our brigade had been fighting unceasingly ever since the battle of September 6th. Would they have time to blow up all the bridges behind them? Should we be obliged to wait until our sappers had built new ones before we could resume our pursuit? We were particularly anxious about 2 fine officers that our Colonel had just sent out on a reconnaissance, F., of the Chasseurs d'Afrique, and my old friend O., of our squadron. We wondered anxiously whether they would be able to perform their task, to get at all costs as far as the Marne, and let us know by dawn whether the river could be crossed either at Mont Saint-Père, Jalgorn, Passy-sur-Marne, or Dormans. Nothing could have been more hazardous than these expeditions, made on a dark night across a district still occupied by the enemy. The night was short. Before day dawned, the horses were saddled and ready to mount. And as soon as the first rays of morning filtered through my squadron, which had been told off as advance guard for the brigade, rapidly descended the steep slopes which commanded the small town of Condé. A.'s troop led. My business was to reconnoitre the eastern part of the town with mine, whilst F., with his troop, was to see to the western quarters. With sabres drawn, our chasseurs distributed themselves briskly, by squads, through the streets of the old city. The horses' hoofs resounded cheerily on the paved streets between the old grey houses. The inhabitants ventured out upon their doorsteps, in spite of the early hour, with some hesitation at first, but glad indeed when they saw our light blue uniforms. They cheered, crying, "They are gone! They are gone!" But some old folk replied more calmly to my questions. "Monsieur l'officier, have a care. They were here an hour ago with a large number of horses and guns. There was even a general, with his whole staff, lodged up at the great house up there. We would not swear that some of them are not still there." I collected my troop, and then quickly went to the château which stood at the northern entrance of Condé. It was a rather fine building, but I had not the time to notice its architectural style. Haste was necessary, for the brigade behind me was due to arrive. As far as I remember, the château formed a harmonious whole, and the different parts of it showed up cheerfully against the dark foliage of the park, which was still glittering after the night's rain. The building was in the form of a horseshoe, and in the centre there was a kind of courtyard bordered by 2 rows of orange trees in tubs. I at once posted 2 guards, one on the road to provide against any surprise, and the other at the park entrance to prevent egress, in case any fugitive should attempt to pass. Then, with the rest of my men, I rode through the large gilded iron gates at a trot. In the avenue which led to the house 2 men were standing motionless. One of them, dressed in black and clean-shaven, appeared to be some old servant of the family. The other must have been one of the gardeners. Their pale faces and red eyes showed that they had had little sleep that night. "Well, my friend," said I to one of them, "is there anybody left at your place?" "Sir," he answered, "I couldn't tell you, for I have not set foot in the house since they left it. What I do know is that they have feasted all night and got horribly drunk. They have drunk the whole cellar dry, and I shouldn't be surprised if some of them are still under the table." But when I asked him to come in with me to act as a guide for our visit, he refused with a look of horror. He trembled all over at the thought of seeing perchance one of the guests who had been forced upon him. As there was no time to be lost, I told my men to dismount at once, and gave orders to one corporal to search the right wing of the building, to another to reconnoitre the left wing. I myself undertook to see about the central block with the rest of my troop. We had to make haste, so I instructed my subordinates to go quickly through the different rooms and not to inspect them in detail. The entrance door was wide open. Taking my revolver in my hand, I entered the hall, which was in an indescribable disorder. Orderlies had evidently slept and had their meals there, for the stone floor was littered with straw, and empty bottles, sardine boxes and pieces of bread were lying about. But when I opened the door of the dining room, I could not help pausing for a moment to look at the strange sight before me. The grey light of that September morning came in through 4 large windows and shone dimly upon the long table. The officers of the Guard had evidently made their arrangements well. They had levied contribution upon all the silver plate that could be found, which was hardly necessary, for as they had arrived too late to have a proper meal prepared, they had to be content with what they had brought with them. The contrast between the rich plate, some of it broken, the empty silver dishes, and the empty tins of preserved meat was strange indeed. But they had solaced themselves in the cellar. Innumerable bottles, both empty and full, were piled upon the furniture. Costly glasses of all shapes and sizes, some empty, others still half full, were standing about in every direction. The white tablecloth was soiled with large purple stains. The floor was littered with bits of smashed glass. By the table the chairs that had been pushed back or overturned showed the number of drinkers to have been about 10. An acrid smell of tobacco and wine hung about this scene of an overnight orgy. One thing I specially remember: the sight of an officer's cap with a red band hanging from one of the branches of the large chandelier in the centre of the room. I could not help picturing to my mind the head of the man it had belonged to, some Rittmeister with an eyeglass, fat pink cheeks and neck bulging over the collar of his tunic. What a pity he had been able to decamp. That is the kind of countenance we should so much have liked to see closer and face to face. But I could not wait. We rushed hastily through the drawing-rooms, turned upside down, and bedrooms where the beds still bore traces of the summary use by heavy bodies, but we found no forgotten drunkard in them. My 2 corporals were already waiting for us when we returned to the courtyard. They had not found any one in their search. Quickly we mounted, and passed rapidly out of the gilded gates. The old servant and the gardener were still on the same spot, standing silent and depressed. They said not a word to us, nor did they make any sign. They seemed to be completely unhinged and incapable of understanding what had happened. I had hardly returned to the squadron when I saw a sight I can never forget. At a turn in the road 3 horsemen came towards us, covered in blood. I recognised F., the officer of the Chasseurs d'Afrique, who had been sent out to reconnoitre the evening before. He had lost his cap, and had his head bound up with a blood-stained handkerchief. His left arm was likewise slung in an improvised bandage tied round his neck. He was followed